afternoon for those of us that are joining
Good
us
morning.
outside of Brazil. Meu nome é Paul Heritage. Eu sou diretor de
My name is
People's
Paul
Palace
Heritage.
Project,
I am the director of People's
na
Palace
Queen Mary
Project,
University of London.
research centre at Queen Mary University in London. It's a great pleasure to be here today with you. This is our third event in a series of webinars that we're organising
toolkits, methodologies,
in order to share methodologies, toolkits about the impact and the risks to the environment and cultural heritage because of the climate crisis. But we also want to think together with you how intangible and tangible cultural heritage could be an act of resistance and resilience against the impact of the climate crisis. We're talking about things like earthquakes and all those other kind of climate emergencies that happen. And we're going to be speaking about very different contexts. Obviously, we want to speak about Brazil, and we want to talk not just about the risks here in Brazil, but also the way that Brazilian culture could resist these risks. But we're also going to be talking about the situation in Africa. And the idea is to be able to share our toolkits and ideas all around the world so that we can all think together about how to resist and see what we can do together. As I've spoken before, People's Palace Project has this role of, facilitating these conversations. And if you have any questions about this, later on after the webinar, you please get in touch with us so that we can construct together a means of reducing the impact of the climate crisis. If you want some of our toolkits as well, we're here to facilitate this dialogue and this exchange. So now I'm going to ask Fabiana Comparato, my colleague, to speak, who's going to explain everything in her perfect English, remembering that we have translation channels here. So she is now going to introduce us to our two guests for today. Thank you ever so much. So I'm going to start speaking in Portuguese because we've got two speakers today. We've got Luana Campos and Dr. Will Megarry. And today it's going to be a little bit different because we're not going to be talking about a methodology from Brazil, but we have a representative here who's from Brazil and who's going to talk a little bit more about the situation here and the role of heritage and how we can measure the effects of the climate crisis on our cultural heritage. So I'm going to start with Luana Campos. She is a doctor in cultural material, and she's recognized here in Brazil and did her doctorate at the Federal University of Pernambuco. She is now based at the Federal University of Mato Grosso do Sul, and she's also the head of a laboratory in Pantanal, and she looks at sustainable development in a changing climate in Brazil. So Luana, it's a pleasure to have you here today. I'm going to ask you to speak now. And then I will also present Dr. Will Megarry, who's going to be our second speaker today, who's an archaeologist from Ireland and also a member of ICOMOS. So over to Luana. Thank you very much.
Fabiana. É prazer estar novamente aqui.
Thank you very much, Fabiana. It's a real pleasure to be here once again in this project. It's the second time that I'm taking part. I'm very honored to be invited. And we're going to talk about climate change and cultural heritage, and this is something that I've worked on with colleagues from ICOMOS, and we've tried to bring this debate to different universities as an urgent debate. And we're still kind of slightly lost with this change, because even though we're talking a lot about climate change these days, and we've been talking about it for more or less 20 years, and even more intensely during the last 10 years, this area needs a lot more study and a lot more knowledge. So I'm going to do something that I don't normally do, but I am going to read today. And the idea is to make it a little bit easier for us to interact. So I prepared this text and also to help the translators. So I'd just like to add that what we're going to be talking about today, or what I'm going to be talking about today, is more of a reflection based on a methodology that we used. So if you could show my presentation. So my intention is to start by criticizing public policies, because they try and standardize the answers to the issues of climate change. But because of my role as a teacher, I'd like to just clarify certain things, because even though climate change is a key word, it's being used constantly in media, in academic presentations and advertising, and we sort of like assume that everybody understands what we're talking about. However, when we start the debate, even between specialists, we can understand that the concept of climate change is a paradigm, and certain concepts that are linked to it, such as exposure, danger, vulnerability, and risk, still need a consensus around those terms so that we can carry on. But we don't want to make this problem of defining the concept the center of our work. What we're looking for is help and the necessary actions to act in the social, cultural, and economical realms. So I'd like to just highlight two reflections that are rather ontological. The first reference is a reference to, or a question about, which discipline climate change belongs to. Because here in Brazil, we haven't got a definition by CAPES, which is our main sort of higher education institution, higher education rather, institution. So we need to define this in some ways. And the second issue is the practical relationship between using this concept and its relationship to ideological domination and colonialization, because they end up being linked to other issues, especially when we're talking about cultural heritage. I think there's a little bit of a delay between the slides. So I showed you on the last slide, I showed you the standardized definition of risk. And here are the different areas of CAPES that are recognized as educational fields. And as you can see, there is no area here for climate change, which is a difficulty for people who work in this field and who want to integrate themselves into these faculties. It doesn't have a defined field yet within academia. So if we look at the relationship between the scientific field, which is still, as I said, very ill-defined, which go beyond the ideas of climatology or the concept of climatology. We can find certain precepts where we have some kind of concept consensus,
acadêmicas para o
and we know that
ambiente
we need to
político,
extrapolate these
social,
academic
econômico e para,
discussions
no nosso
so
caso
that they
aqui em
become
especial,
debated
o
within other
ambiente
spheres like the
cultural.
political, economic, social,
Não
and
estamos
cultural
aqui
spheres.
para definir que as alterações climáticas são aquelas
So we're not here
transformações
to define
ocorridas na atmosfera dentro de um
what
período
are
maior ou igual a 30
climate
anos,
changes
ou para nos debruçarmos sobre
over the
as
last 30 years,
obviedades,
and
as
we're also not here
influências
to sort of investigate
antrópicas no
the
período
obvious
pós-revolução industrial, ou
anthropological
mesmo sobre a
influences on
existência ou não
the
de um
planet
antropoceno.
since the Industrial
Estamos
Revolution.
aqui porque a
And
questão das
we're not here
mudanças
to discuss
climáticas
whether the
ultrapassa
Anthropocene
as
exists or
barreiras
not.
da
We're
academia e
here
se
to
torna
look at the
um
issue of how
modulador
these
de
climate
cenário
changes
futuro que afeta todas as
transport these
pessoas em
different
seus
academic
mais amplos
definitions.
aspectos,
It affects
desde a produção
everybody in the
econômica à
widest possible ways,
capacidade de
from
manutenção das suas
economic production
práticas
to
tradicionais.
maintaining traditional practices.
Mas, pelo que observo, não estamos
But from what
preparados
we observe,
estruturalmente,
we're
conceitualmente,
really not
para
prepared
produzir
structurally or
conhecimentos
conceptually
integrados
to
de
be able
áreas
to
tão
produce
abrangentes
integrated
como
knowledge
as
from
que
areas that are
demandam a
so
área de estudo das
diverse,
mudanças
um,
climáticas. O
which is
campo do
what is really
patrimônio
needed for us to be
cultural
able
é
to
um bom
tackle the climate
exemplo
change.
dessa nossa
So if we look
incapacidade.
at
Se
cultural
pensarmos numa
heritage, this
realidade
shows
como
us
o Brasil,
our
de
inability.
dimensões
See if we look at
continentais, na
Brazil, which is a
iminência de
continental-sized
transformações
country,
ambientais
and the
severas, temos
imminence
ainda uma
here of all
série de
these like
questões
very
ainda a ser
serious
respostas. O que devemos
environmental
preservar?
transformations, we still have a
Como
number of questions
devemos
that don't have
preservar?
answers.
Quando
What should we
devemos
preserve?
iniciar
How
as
should we
ações
preserve it?
de
When should we
preservação?
start
Nós devemos falar em
preserving it?
preservação,
So
mitigação,
we talk about
adaptação
preservation,
ou
mitigation,
resiliência.
adaptation, and
Quais
resilience.
são as prioridades?
But which of
E
those
esta,
are
para
our
mim, é a
priorities?
pergunta mais significativa.
And so
É
that for me is
certo
the most
que não
important question.
estabelecer uma
It's
prioridade para o campo do
it's
patrimônio,
clear that if we
ou
don't
dizer que
establish some
tudo é
priorities,
prioridade na preservação
and
do
if we say that,
patrimônio,
or if we say that
lembrando as
everything is a
lições
priority,
presentistas de Artog, é o mesmo de que dizer
and
que
if
nada
we
tem
remember
prioridade.
the presentism
Para
that
isso,
Hartog
precisamos fazer
forwarded, then
algo que por
what we're doing
vezes
here is we're
esquecemos
saying that nothing
no
has a
corre-corre do
priority.
dia a
So
dia, nas papeladas burocráticas da
what we need to
academia
do
ou
here
dos
is something that
nossos
we forget very
infindáveis
often in our daily
projetos em
work in
busca de
academic
financiamentos.
institutions.
É preciso parar, identificar o que é
We need to
prioridade. E
stop,
para isso é
identify
preciso
what is
olhar,
priority, and
para
for that
compreender,
we need
de
to
identificar
observe.
e
It's an
certamente de
observation to
mensurar, que é essa nossa
understand and
temática aqui.
identify and
E aqui
measure
entra, então, no nosso objeto da
what
fala
needs to
sobre
be
os
looked
indicadores de
at.
vulnerabilidade.
And so now I'm going to talk about the indicators
Quando
of
pensamos, por
vulnerability.
exemplo, no termo indicadores de
So
vulnerabilidade ou
when we think
indicadores de
about these
vulnerabilidade
indicators,
social, indicadores de vulnerabilidade
whether we
climática,
talk about social vulnerability or
econômicas ou
environmental
culturais,
vulnerability
é
or
sobre o
economic
verbo ver que nós estamos
vulnerability,
falando. Segundo o guia
we talk
para a
about the
elaboração
verb
de
to
indicadores
see,
da UFPE,
to observe, because
indicadores é uma ou mais medidas
these
de ordem
indicators are one
quantitativa
or
ou
more
qualitativa,
measures, which are either
dotado de
quantitative or
significado
qualitative measures,
particular e utilizado
which
para
have
organizar
specific
e captar
significance
as
and
informações
can be
relevantes
used
dos
to organize
elementos
and
que
capture
compõem
the
o
most
objeto da
relevant
observação.
information
É um
of the
recurso
elements which make
metodológico
up the object
que
of
informa
observation. So
empiricamente
it's
sobre a
a
evolução dos
methodological
aspectos
resource
observados.
which
Vamos
informs us
sublinhar aqui essa
empirically
questão do
about the
recurso
evolution of the
metodológico.
object that's being
Quando falei
observed.
sobre iniciar essa minha fala com uma crítica,
So when I talked about
a tentativa
starting
de
this
padronização
talk
global
with
das
a
questões
criticism
relacionadas
and this
às mudanças
attempt to
climáticas é sobre isso,
standardize
sobre a
the answers
necessidade
to
de
climate
criar-se
issues,
indicadores
climate change.
diferenciados
This is
para
what
uma
I'm
mesma
talking about.
problemática.
We need to talk different
Não há
indicators for
igualdade
this
dos
same
efeitos das
problem.
mudanças
There's no
climáticas
equality
em
in terms
diferentes
of the
regiões do
effects that
mundo,
climate change is having
apesar de
in
haver
different regions around the
paralelos.
world, even though there are
Assim como
parallels, of
certamente
course.
alguns grupos sofrerão
And
mais do que outros,
no doubt,
porque uma coisa é
certainly
nós
some groups are going to
falarmos das
suffer
mudanças
more with climate
climáticas
change,
no
because
seu
when we talk
aspecto
about climate change and
ambiental, nas suas
its
forçantes,
environmental
nas suas
aspect,
causas, a outra é falarmos das
its
pessoas que estão
causes,
envolvidas.
we're talking about people who are behind those. So, when we talk about climate change and heritage, it doesn't make sense to treat heritage and climate change if we're not talking about the people who are involved, because it's people who give significance to heritage. So it's a huge challenge to be able to address these issues in terms of different disciplines academically.
Para essa reflexão, penso que seja o momento de olharmos para o que chamamos de sul global.
It's time for us to look at what we call the global south.
O slide. Aqui a definição. Realmente eu não estou conseguindo.
So here we have the definition.
A velocidade da fala com os slides, mas
I'm trying to synchronize the speed of my talk to the slides. But anyway, can we go to the next slide, please?
Ou também esse chamado sul global nós podemos chamar
Then
de aqueles que
this
menos
global
impactam
south
o
can
ambiente
be
e que
called as
mais
well those that
sofrerão com as
impact the environment the
alterações
most, the least, and that
que
will suffer the
remete a uma
most from
segunda
climate
questão, que é
change.
uma questão de
And
cunho
this takes me to
ideológico,
a second
algo que eu
issue,
falei,
which is
existem
more
duas
ideological.
questões, né? Nós caímos
Because, like I
na
said,
noção
it's two
de
issues that we have.
dominação ideológica
So we end
e
up
de
having
decolonialidade do
this
ser.
notion of
Pois quando
ideological
olhamos para o
domination
sul
and
global, estamos
decolonialization of the
falando
being.
de uma
Because when we
região
look at the global south, we're talking about
politicamente
a
impactada
region
pelos pensamentos
that's politically very
colonialistas.
impacted
Para dar
by the
exemplo,
colonial
no mês passado eu
thinking.
tive a oportunidade
Let
de
me give you an
estar com o
example.
Dr.
Last
Roxy
month, I had the
Cole,
opportunity to be
do
with
Instituto
Dr.
de Meteorologia
Roxy
Tropical da Índia,
Cole from the
e
Indian
nós
Institute of
falávamos pouco
Tropical
sobre
Meteorology,
investimento
and we talked a
nas
little bit
ações de
about
mitigação em
investing
países
in mitigation activities
subdesenvolvidos ou
in
países em
countries that
desenvolvimento.
are
Eu
in
perguntava para
development.
ele se havia uma
And I would ask
justificativa
him
de
whether there was
investir em
some kind of
ações de mitigação
justification
nesses
to
locais.
justify
Ele me
in
explicou que
mitigation
as ações de
activities in these
mitigação
locations. He
se
told me
justificavam
that the
desde o
mitigation
início do
activities
processo de
were
desenvolvimento
justified
desses
from
países.
the very
É
beginning of the
importante
process of
já
development of these
estabelecer
countries.
medidas de
It's
mitigação
important to
durante o
already
crescimento
establish
econômico
mitigation measures
dessas
during
regiões, o que
economic
faz
growth
sentido, pois
of these regions.
ideologicamente
And that makes
a
sense because
ambição de
ideologically,
consumo do sul global é se
the
igualar ao
ambitions of
norte
consumption
global,
of the
pois
global
grande
south
parte desses países em
involves becoming equal
desenvolvimento
to the global north,
foi
because most of these
colonizado pela
countries in
ideia de que a
development
dominação da
were
natureza é
colonized by the
sinônimo de
idea that the
civilização.
domination of nature
E
is
aqui, só para
synonymous
fazer
with civilization.
recorte, entrando pouco na minha noção de
And
historiadora,
now I just
preciso
want to
lembrar
go
o que
back
o
to
professor
my
Luiz
understanding as a
Fernandes
historian.
Unicamp
I'd like to remind you that
fala, que eu
Professor
acho
Luis Fernandes from
espetacular, que,
Unicamp
segundo ele,
says
a
something that I find
Europa só se
spectacular.
torna
According to him,
referência
Europe
de
only becomes a
civilização, ou
reference in
referência no
terms of
conceito de
civilization,
civilização,
or it only becomes a reference in
atrelado
the
à
concept of
erupção, porque
civilization
detém
linked
a caneta,
to erudition
o que me
because it
remete
has
a outra noção
the
trazida
pen.
por Jean-Paul
That brings me
Sartre em
to
seu
another
livro
issue
O
brought
Uso
to
do
us by
Método,
Jean-Paul Sartre
onde
in
vai
his
dizer
book,
que o
The
método
Use
é uma
of Methods,
importante
where he
arma de
says that the
dominação.
method is
E a
an
Europa
important weapon of
soube
domination and that
utilizar
Europe
esse
knew how to
método de
utilize
registro
this
de uma
method of
informação a longo
registration,
prazo ao seu
the
favor,
registration
como
of
uma área,
information in the
uma
long
arma
term.
de
It was able to
dominação.
use this in
O
its
que isso
favor
tem a
as a
ver
weapon of
com as
domination.
questões
So
que
what
nós
does this
estamos
have to
tratando
do
aqui,
with
que é
the
a
issues that we're talking
mensuração?
about here?
Ainda
That
hoje
is, the
esperamos uma
measurement.
solução
Well,
que uma solução
today we're
apareça
still
aos
awaiting
países
for a
desenvolvidos ou
solution
muito
coming
ancorada
from
nas
developed
novas
countries.
tecnologias. Mas no caso das mudanças
But
climáticas,
in the case of climate
particularmente
change,
na sua relação com o patrimônio,
especially in
a solução
its
pode
relation
não estar
to
nas grandes
heritage, the
tecnologias.
solution might not
Se
come
olharmos
from
para os
these
povos
more developed countries and
indígenas,
their
por exemplo,
technologies. If
que
we look at the
ocuparam
indigenous peoples, for
totalmente o
example,
território
the
onde
populations that
estamos
occupied
na
the
América
whole
até
territory of
1500,
Brazil
identificamos uma série
until
de
the
conhecimentos
1500s, we're able
que
to identify
ultrapassam a
a
noção de
series of knowledge
ciência,
that go beyond the notion of
ultrapassam a noção de
science,
interação e
that
de
go beyond the notion of
sustentabilidade e
interaction,
outros conceitos que só
sustainability, and
estão
other
em
concepts
discussão ou na
which
moda
are
atualmente.
basically
A
being
ideia,
discussed
por
or
exemplo,
invoked
de
today.
cruzamento genético,
For example, the idea of genetic crossing and knowledge from the medical field and the stabilization of soil during floods, such as what happened here in Pantanal, where the indigenous people did different kinds of landfills and the use of natural inputs for creating black earth or the creation of canals. All of this came from traditional knowledge, which survived extreme climate change in the past. Although we don't find a link between the speed of global warming that we have today and the warming of the past, we have to understand that transformations are transformations. Similarly, quilombolas also have this knowledge. All of the traditional peoples, all of these traditional peoples and traditional communities that survived all of these transformations, they have something to tell us. So when I say that we have this primary need to look at the territory in order to see the conditions, I would like to call your attention to the need to have a multifocal discipline which is able to judge these issues. And that's because for many years we've been looking at the future in order to think about the survival of humanity. A lot of TV shows such as Star Trek and other series regarding the dystopian futures, they are present in our imagination. Today, I can say for sure that it's not enough to look at the future. We need to look at the future based on the notions that were constructed in the past. That is, it's with traditional knowledge linked to new technologies that humanity will be able to deal with these climate crises. Please go to the next slide, please. I inserted some images to illustrate what I'm saying, but I ended up not referencing these images in my talk. But here we have an example of technology linked to traditional knowledge. So this group here in the Amazon uses those figures which are sold on the internet, NFTs, yeah, that's what they're called. They use that to raise funds to fight deforestation and illegal gold mining. Another example of the use of traditional knowledge to find solutions for dealing with the impact of climate change that happened and that will impact this cultural heritage, that's material and immaterial, is basically this project that we're developing with a group of professionals from different institutions in the city of Ubatuba, in the coast of the state of São Paulo. And we want to expand this methodology because, like I said, Brazil has continental dimensions, and it allows us to imagine activities in different biomes, in different contexts, as long as these methodologies are adapted to these different contexts. On the one hand, we have a project that's financed by FAPESP that will deal with material heritage, that is the built structure. And here we have the ruins of Lagoa, which is what we see on the left. Then we have the flour mill, and we have the casarão of Ubatuba at the bottom. So here we have three built structures where we will be doing an analysis of the vulnerability conditions based on bringing together different methodologies based on the territory and on the knowledge of those who hold that knowledge that's linked to these assets. Here we have another example, which is a project that we're developing in the Quilombola community of Camburi with financing from ICOMOS. And here we're thinking together with the community about how climate change can impact their territory. We're also thinking about the priorities for this group, and we're thinking about how to find, in traditional knowledge, solutions for the immediate effects of climate change. So the idea of these projects and of these methodologies and of these approaches, because they're more than methodologies, they're approaches, the idea is to invert the logic, which seems to be simple but isn't. And the idea here is to, instead of bringing a pre-established knowledge to be applied to a territory, we actually start working at the territory to establish a methodology of measurement, of vulnerability, and to identify priorities. And we try, because we know that the knowledge related to these changes exists in these territories. So it seems very utopian, but it's actually very functional, because today you have a series of mechanisms that you can use both to identify these functions and this knowledge, and also to improve them or to implement them in a way that's more effective. We are not proposing that humanity start leaving with the original inhabitants of the territories. What we're proposing is that these traditional groups have the knowledge that's capable of transforming the preservation of their heritage, and in some way also the heritage of urban environments and environments that are more marginal in large cities. So to conclude my talk, I'd like to say that as part of the Committee for Climate Change, I can say that we're organizing with IFA some seminars regarding climate change, specifically for the southeastern coastal region of Brazil. Those who have been following the news know that this region of the Green Belt, that includes Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and Ilha Grande, this area has suffered a lot with landslides. And so we have climate and environmental characteristics that are very unique, that are linked to a greater amount of rainfall or water in a shorter period of time. And this is something that has happened quite frequently in a cyclical way in the past few years. So this causes landslides in areas that beforehand were not occupied. And this is a result of gentrification and disordered land development. And so we need to think about all of this, but we have to think starting from the people who inhabit a territory, because it's these people who understand this issue. It's not a matter of creating some kind of fallacy. It's actually a matter of operationalizing all of this. And now we've also started organizing COP30 that will be happening in Belém, the state of Pará. And so we will be applying this work methodology with some traditional communities in order to bring to light the debate regarding climate change and heritage, because this is a debate that's still very much marginalized in this large field, which is the field of climate change. So I'm available to answer any questions. I'd like to thank you once again, Fabiana and Paul, for the invitation. And I'm available to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Now, because we're about to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Will Megarry. I just wanted to make a few comments, because I thank you so much, Luana. I think it was an amazing presentation. especially when you say that there is this need to bring the debate of climate change to a social, political, and cultural level, and how hard it is to do it still in Brazil, given, you know, the difficulties within our structure. Luana commented on, right at the beginning of her presentation, on CAPES, and I just wanted to explain. CAPES is a foundation of the Brazilian federal government agency under the Ministry of Education, which is responsible for the quality assurance in undergrad and postgraduate institutions. So within this framework, there's still a lot to advance in the debate on how to address and measure climate change within this political and social and cultural debate, you know, other than just the environmental side. Also, something that struck me very much was when she talks about how to talk about cultural heritage, we need to talk about people. And that reminded me of our webinar last week, in which that was also commented upon, because we usually look at cultural heritage within structures, but we forget to look at people, and how it's impossible to not associate or to look at people and talk to people when we're talking about cultural heritage, because it only makes sense, the cultural heritage only makes sense when there's people in it. And lastly, which was very interesting, is how knowledge from traditional communities is strategic and essential to create methodology to measure and even mitigate climate change. So not only look at the future, but necessarily look at the past and the present, and how traditional communities have been addressing this issue, and to develop methodologies that us, in a way, I'm going to use this expression, but site-specific, you know, community-specific, instead of bringing it from outside. So now I'll introduce Dr. Will Megarry, who will speak next. He's a landscape archaeologist from Ireland. He's focal point for heritage at the International Council on Monuments and Sites and head of its Climate Action Working Group. He's a senior lecturer in archaeology at the School of Natural and Built Environment at Queen's University Belfast. He has directed many projects exploring the intersections between culture and climate change, including the Heritage on the Edge project and the Values-Based Climate Change Risk Assessment. He's also a member of the ICOMOS Ireland and an expert member of the ICOMOS International Scientific Committee on Archaeological Heritage Management. So, Dr. William, it's with you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I always feel like it sounds very formal, and I should maybe say that I like pina coladas and dancing in the rain as well, to give a bit of personal context. But thank you very much. And thank you, Fabiana. Thank you, Paul, from People's Palace Project. And especially thank you to Luana for that really excellent introductory presentation. I found myself taking a lot of notes, both for my own learning and also because I think we can return to some of those themes which you introduced, which are really very important when thinking about climate change. So if I could maybe ask for my presentation to start, and I will speak from that. Thank you. And we can go on to the next slide. So Fabiana's given me a nice introduction already. Thank you very much for that. As she said, I'm an archaeologist by training, who now works in the area of cultural heritage and climate change. My interest in the area probably started in thinking about the past, thinking about how past people have adapted to life in often very marginal environments. My research focuses on the prehistory of insular societies, and islands often represent the coalface of climate change and cultural change in the past. But I think really over the last several years, my focus has become much more on the subject due to the urgency of the climate crisis and the enormous impacts we're seeing, not just on our cultural heritage, but also on wider society, on people, which, as we've heard today, need to be at the very heart of our response to the climate emergency. Next slide, please. And I think this question of why cultural heritage, when there is an emergency, when we hear daily about loss and damage of life, of well-being, it is a very important question that we as heritage people need to be able to answer. And I think there are many answers to this question, but perhaps just to provide three. Our cultural heritage is our cumulative memory of humanity. And we often say in ICOMOS that it's what anchors us to place and gives us a sense of community. And its loss is acutely felt. During the most recent conferences of parties in Glasgow and more recently in Sharm el-Sheikh, we've noticed impassioned pleads from nations, primarily small island developing states. And people are not talking about the impacts to their economies. They're not talking often about impacts to their, to larger things. They're talking about the loss of identity, the loss of heritage. People are talking about their children. They're talking about the future, and they're talking about their past. And also, I think cultural heritage is about people, and it's about things which are important to people. And we heard a little bit from Paul at the start about how cultural heritage is an asset in our response, and I think this is very true. I think by bringing heritage into the climate change conversation, we're humanizing a dialogue which is often rightly accused of being very scientific and quite detracted from the conversations of people and their lived experience. Finally, then, I think heritage is important because it's a lens through which we can understand many of the wider issues associated with climate change. We hear all the time at the moment about migration crises, about people being forced from place, and the impacts this has on communities. But these are cultural issues too, and culture allows us to explore these, I think, again, in a way that is human-centered. Next slide, please. And so, as Fabiana said, I am focal point for culture and climate at ICOMOS, which is the International Committee on Council on Monuments and Sites. And ICOMOS has been very active in the area of climate change for quite some time. Really, going back nearly a decade now, we've been engaging in the area of climate change. And our engagement is based on two concepts. The first is that climate change is and will continue to impact on our cultural heritage, both our tangible, our intangible, our procedural cultural heritage. But also that cultural heritage is an asset in our response. It's both a source of resilience for communities responding to climate change, but it also offers us, through a wide variety of ways, avenues and pathways for transformative climate action, not just within the cultural heritage sector, but more widely within society as a whole. And more recently in 2020, when ICOMOS declared a climate emergency, and we're one of the first large heritage organizations to do that, it emphasized and recognized the immense potential of cultural heritage to enable these inclusive, transformative, and just climate action. And this is a message that we are very keen to promote. This is not just about loss. I think sometimes we can be accused of focusing too heavily on the loss from climate change, and it is horrific. But actually, we as cultural heritage people are custodians of an incredible asset to climate action, and it's something that we need to be aware of. Next slide, please. So I wasn't sure how much people would know about climate change and cultural heritage and its impacts on heritage. So I thought we would just very briefly go through some examples just to talk about the wide range of impacts which cultural heritage is experiencing. The examples I'm going to use come from a project called Heritage on the Edge, which was a collaboration between ourselves at ICOMOS, Google Arts and Culture, and SciArc, a US-based digital documentation organization. And it focused on communicating the urgency of climate action through the lens of 5 UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And part of that was communicating the impacts that climate change is having and will have on these sites. The key point here is that heritage sites, and I think UNESCO World Heritage Sites in particular, are iconic and emotive places. And their loss is not just felt by local communities, but it's also felt globally. So they have huge communicative power to communicate the urgency of climate change and the climate crisis. And in this example here, the old and new towns of Edinburgh in Scotland in the United Kingdom, we see a combination of factors caused by increased precipitation, where there is 17% more rainfall than there was 20 years ago, and this rainfall is coming heavier and it's undermining the foundations of significant historical buildings. Another example is Rapa Nui National Park in the Pacific off the coast of Chile, perhaps best known for its iconic mawe, which sit on ahu platforms looking out to sea. An island culture whose past is intricately connected to the opportunities afforded by the sea in terms of travel and colonization, and whose cultural heritage is now deeply impacted and threatened from climate change, as increased storminess, thermal expansion, where warmer seas get bigger and stormier, and coastal erosion is undermining these iconic structures. Next slide, please. The historic mosque city of Bagarhat, situated in the Sundarbans, the north of the Bay of Bengal in Bangladesh, is experiencing climate impacts from a process called efflorescence, where rising water tables caused by rising sea levels is leading to saline intrusion onto the brick architecture of this historic mosque city. This saline, through a process of evaporation, is causing significant corrosive and erosive impacts to the brick mortar and brick facade of these structures and causing a huge amount of damage. It's also impacting the lived experience of people who live in and around and worship at this site, as increased saline levels in the water table are leading to a myriad of health issues. So again, a reminder that these sites often represent both living and past communities, and we need to be careful not to always speak about these sites in the past tense, but that through them we can also explore the lived experience of cultures. Next slide, please. On the Tanzanian coast, at Kilwa Kisawani and Songo Manora in East Africa, the issue again is one of coastal erosion, where rising sea levels and increased storminess are exacerbating erosive processes that started before the climate crisis, and are again impacting not just past cultural heritage and relics, but also the livelihoods and the living conditions of 300 people who live in and around this World Heritage Site. Next slide. And sometimes I think we can be accused of focusing very strongly on these extant sites, these built sites, without realizing that cultural heritage is an incredibly diverse church. We represent both the tangible and the intangible. But just to think slightly about the potential impacts on other types of heritage sites, cultural landscapes are deeply impacted by climate change. Not just the direct impacts of changing weather patterns, but actually in some cases where these landscapes represent histories and cultures of hundreds of years of production, like we see in the rice terraces in the Ifugao in the Philippines, or the coffee landscapes of Colombia, or even the champagne vineyards of France. Changing climates are making traditional production patterns impossible. It's predicted that within 20 years, it might not be possible to grow champagne in large parts of the Champagne region because the weather has changed in such a way. And there's not really any kind of adaptation that we can do to prevent this happening. And as has already been mentioned today, it is doubly tragic that often the impacts of the climate crisis on these living traditions are far more acutely felt by those least responsible for causing the crisis in the first place. Next slide, please. So what is our response to this new reality? As Luana says, there's a lot of talk about climate change, but there's still an awful lot to do. And one of the things we have been focusing on in ICOMOS is the belief that climate change is not like other challenges. Traditional disaster risk methodologies are not always appropriate and are not always the best way to respond to this new reality. And there is a need for us to develop new tools and new methodologies which allow us to respond in ways more specific to the threat we're facing. And one of the concepts often brought up within the context of climate change response is the idea of loss, the idea of managing change, and the idea of adaptation. And I think sometimes we need to think about this in terms of triaging. So rather like a hospital emergency room where a doctor decides the best response based on the symptoms of the patient, so we must accept that it is not going to be possible for us in the heritage sector to save everything. And I think one way of thinking about this is a system where the majority of sites, through careful forward planning and adaptation, can probably be saved. There will then also be some sites that we must save at any cost. The most iconic sites, sites of incredible national and international importance. And then unfortunately, there is also a subset of sites that we're just not going to be able to save, and that we will have to record and we'll have to lose. And this is perhaps one of the hardest areas of our response in the cultural sector, but it's perhaps one that is familiar to people maybe working in an archaeology background, where preservation by record and destruction is a part of our professional practice. Next slide, please. But how do we make these decisions? And what is the basis on which we do this? Again, Luana talked about the how of climate change. How do we respond? Well, one of the ways we need to do it is we need, as a sector, to become more engaged with and familiar with wider climate action and movements. Luana also talked about the idea of language as being a key factor in our response. And the reality is that an awful lot of the issues and delays and problems we encounter in effective climate action comes from the fact that we often don't speak the same language as those working within climate change. And I'll come back to that shortly. Because culture has had a place in the wider climate dialogue for some time. It might not be culture in the inclusive sense and incorporative sense that we sometimes use, but culture was mentioned as far back as the Paris Agreement, of which almost all member states of the UNFCCC are signatories, in 2015, where in the context of adaptation planning, which is how we prepare our sites for the impacts of climate change, it recommended that this should be guided by the best available science and, as appropriate, traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and local knowledge systems. And adaptation is just one part of the global response. We've heard other words today like mitigation, which refers to the reduction of greenhouse gases. But adaptation is a crucial area where culture has long been identified as a response. And this focus on adaptation was again renewed in the COP26 Glasgow to Sharm el-Sheikh initiative, which again called for climate adaptation plans to take into account traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and local knowledge systems. Next slide, please. Now, this desire to engage more meaningfully in dialogue with the wider climate science community was perhaps best manifest in a co-sponsored meeting we organized in ICOMOS between ourselves, UNESCO, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and this happened in December 2021. This meeting happened remotely due to COVID, but brought together over 100 experts from climate science, from cultural heritage, and from natural heritage to discuss the intersections of cultural heritage and climate change and identify key opportunities for increasing dialogue going forward. And these are the outputs from this project, and they're available to download, and I'll provide the link at the end of it. Just before moving on, I'd like to highlight 3 points that came out of this meeting because they link back to Luana's excellent introduction and some of the themes we had earlier in this meeting. The first is that it was identified that language remains one of our most challenging topics. If I was to ask everybody listening here to provide a definition of the phrase mitigation, we would likely have 10s or 20s of different definitions, different depending on what our disciplinary background is. Yet speaking the same language is important in climate action because we need to align our efforts. And from this meeting, it was recognized that there was a need for both disciplines, climate science and cultural heritage, to come together and try to understand each other's shared language better. The second point I'd like to make from this meeting is one of climate justice. It identified that there were huge gaps in our knowledge of how climate change is impacting cultural heritage around the world. And these gaps usually reflect the post-colonial dynamics of our world. Luana talked about Satra and the idea that the pen is a weapon. Well, 95% of everything written about climate change is written by people from wealthy Western countries, funded by wealthy Western funders, working either in wealthy Western countries or in poorer countries with post-colonial relationships. This means we have huge gaps in our understanding about what climate change is actually even doing in large parts of the world, and this dynamic is particularly acute in sub-Saharan Africa. Essentially, as one of our participants said, we cannot solve the problem of climate change using the same approach and scientific approach which caused it in the first place. We need to be more inclusive in listening and enabling research and understanding in other parts. The final point then is the importance of humanizing the conversation. Members from the climate science community, from the IPCC, who attended this meeting continually reinforced how valuable it was to hear about the lived experience of people in climate change and how culture represented a really incredible way for us to engage people more meaningfully in that conversation. So next slide, please. So what is our plan? If we think back to our triaging slide, and we appreciate the understanding of engaging as meaningfully as possible with climate science and understanding the need, what are our options? Well, the first options for sites, and I'm going to use the site of Kilwa Kisawani here as a continual example for the rest of this presentation, which we will come back to, is adaptation. So according to the IPCC, adaptation is the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects. It's generally preemptive. It's understanding what future impacts will be like and preparing sites against them. Typical examples of adaptation might be the construction of protective walls or dikes to prevent impacts from sea level or flooding rivers. Next slide, please. Within our own cultural context as heritage professionals then, adaptation is perhaps best understood as an ongoing process managed over time by committing to shorter-term actions embedded within a long-term vision. It encourages us to think about adaptation not as a reactive process which we only start once the challenge becomes visible, but as an ongoing process embedded within a longer-term understanding of how climate change is likely to impact our sites. Specifically, a thorough understanding of the vulnerability of our sites to climate change in the future. Next slide, please. Well, a huge amount of the focus with adaptation is often on hard infrastructure. The reality is that there are many nature-based solutions that can be more effective. At the site of Kilwa-Kiswani, for example, the planting of mangroves, which had long grown along the coastline, is one of the most effective ways to prevent coastal erosion because it takes the energy out of the waves and out of the erosive processes. Here we can see these mangroves which have been recently planted in front of one of the great monuments at the site. Next slide. Then we have this candidate of sites which would be saved at all cost. These generally refer to some of our best known sites, the example here showing Edinburgh Castle and the efforts being made to shore up the side of Edinburgh Castle to stop rocks falling off it. Other examples might include attempts being made at Venice to prevent flooding, or the site of Skara Brae in northern Scotland, where huge effort is being taken. But these sites take up a huge amount of resources, and there is a genuinely difficult conversation to be had within the heritage sector about the justification for saving some of these sites if it means we're going to lose other sites. Next slide, please. When we do need to record sites, maybe we're going to lose them anyway. Maybe we're recording sites as a way of monitoring the ongoing efficacy of adaptation measures. We're often faced with a challenge of how do we record sites fast enough. The tools which we use within archaeology, for example, are quite slow. We might spend many months excavating an archaeological site, recording things in detail. Yet the urgency of this situation requires us to think again. And this is where digital tools and technologies can be incredibly useful. This shows an image produced by a project in Ireland done by the Discovery Programme of a site called Dún Beag, which we are losing and are going to lose to climate change. You can see the collapsing landslide in the front here where we've lost one whole part of the site. And the response here is to regularly record this process using drones to create 3D models. Next slide, please. Back in Tanzania, this is the Great Mosque at Kilwa-Kiswani. As part of the Google project, we undertook 3D modeling of key monuments at this site, including the Great Mosque. This was very valuable both to communicate heritage to a wider audience, and these models can be downloaded and looked at in 3D and augmented reality, but also provides a baseline to monitor ongoing impacts to the site from the impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. So how do we make these decisions? How do we choose where do we need to develop adaptation plans? How do we choose what sites do we preserve at all costs? How do we make those particularly difficult decisions to decide about what sites need to be recorded and maybe lost? Well, again, coming back to this question Dr. Luana brought up about the how of climate change, I think vulnerability analysis is a key part of this process. And what I want to talk about for the remainder of my talk today is a project which we ran for the last few years, looking at developing new tools and methodologies for understanding vulnerability of cultural World Heritage sites. And this project was focused on sub-Saharan Africa and 2 sites in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, there are many tools for understanding vulnerability, and I'm going to go through the tools that we have been developing and continue to develop through ICOMOS. But they integrate various levels of things that we've already talked about today. The first step is understanding key values. What is it that makes a site important? The second step is to look at climate science. What is it that climate science is telling us is going to happen at these sites? We can then explore how that change is going to affect the key values of the sites. But we also need to take into account the adaptive capacity and resilience of sites and communities before we can understand vulnerability. So next slide, please. So the Borough Charter, which is a seminal ICOMOS document on conservation practice, notes that conservation of a place should identify and take into consideration all aspects of cultural and natural significance without unwarranted emphasis on any one value at the expense of another. When we talk about conservation decisions and adaptation decisions being values-based, this is what we are referring to. But values are multifaceted. There are many values associated with heritage sites. They're not just heritage values. They're not just that a building is an outstanding example of 18th century architecture. They're also social values. They're religious values. They're economic values. They could be natural values associated with the site. And as heritage professionals, we need to become comfortable with working with and understanding a plurality of values at our heritage sites. This can be particularly challenging at World Heritage Sites, where OUV, or outstanding universal value, is deemed to have preeminence over other value systems. But we cannot conserve buildings at sites by sacrificing the people who live in them. We need to take a broad understanding of values when we do our conservation practice. Once we've identified our values, we then need to identify our attributes. And attributes are the physical and tangible and intangible things that attest to these values. So it might be a structure which attends to a heritage value. It might be a view of particular importance to tourists, which links in to an economic value. But by understanding the actual tangible and intangible attributes of a site, we can then understand climate impacts, which we'll look at in the next slide, please. One of the areas we've been very keen to promote in ICOMOS over the last 10 years or so is the need to engage more meaningfully and to link and connect the heritage sector with climate science. A huge amount of climate models are looking to the future under different scales and different scenarios. And sometimes we hear phrases like business as usual, or whether or not we can reduce carbon emissions, or whether or not carbon emissions will actually increase. The key point here is that we do not know what the future looks like, and there are many variables that can change, but we can get an understanding from climate science as to what future climates might look like based on different scenarios. So when undertaking vulnerability assessment, once we have identified our values and our attributes, what makes a site important, we then need to look at what the climate is likely to look like in the future under different scenarios. We can do this at various scales. We promote the downscaling of climate models as close as possible to the site itself, and also over different timeframes. So what is the right time frame for a site? Is it 2040, 2060, 2080, or 2100? And those are decisions to be made by the local community and heritage custodians. Next slide, please. Once we have the values and attributes and we understand how climate will change in the future, we can then map these climate hazards to the attributes. So to give an example here, if a site has a value which is important archaeological remains, and the attribute for that values are the remains themselves and subsurface burial areas, then we need to focus on key parts of the climate model which will impact those attributes, in this case, precipitation events, so heavy rain, and coastal erosion. And these will depend both on the sites, but also on the values that are deemed to be most important at those sites. Next slide, please. One of the final steps then, before we can assess the vulnerability of a site, is to understand what our resilience or adaptive capacity is at these sites. This is the ability of a system to absorb, withstand, and bounce back after an adverse event. So an example, if a site has a very active maintenance crew who can regularly empty drain pipes, regularly fix walls, regularly change tiles on roofs, the impacts of climate change will be substantially reduced by that adaptive capacity. Similarly, if a cultural landscape has indigenous or traditional techniques to fix terracing or to alleviate excess amounts of water, the adaptive capacity of those sites and those values will be greater against increased precipitation. However, there will be other situations where there is little or no adaptive capacity, and this makes those values and those sites more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. So how do we actually do this in person? Let's take a look at an example. ICOMOS has long partnered with colleagues from James Cook University, specifically colleagues of mine called John Day and Scott Heron, to develop something called the Climate Vulnerability Index, which is a tool that they developed to look specifically at the vulnerability of World Heritage Sites. And part of the project in Sub-Saharan Africa, which I introduced, the CVI Africa Project, was to look at the utility of this tool in an African context. Next slide, please. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. The first is that to date, up until before this, the CVI Africa Project had only been, the CVI technique, had only been applied in Australia and Western Europe, where heritage capacities were high. But the need is most acute in places that lack that level of heritage capacity, often in this case in Sub-Saharan Africa. So a key part of this project was to try and assess whether or not this technique was effective in places that needed it most, places without the same heritage capacity as we might have in Europe. Another part of it was to try and move this area of vulnerability assessment away from being a specialist exercise that can only be undertaken by experts to being something that site heritage managers can undertake at their own sites. So the project included foundational training for a cohort of 6 African heritage professionals in this technique, CVI, and also then a hands-on learning through the application of the technique at 2 World Heritage Sites, one in Tanzania and one in Nigeria at the Sukur Cultural Landscape in northeast Nigeria. Next slide, please. The project was funded by the Arts Humanities Research Council and the UK Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. And we had an incredibly large team of project partners led by my university here in Northern Ireland and including other UK partners. Our primary African partner was the African World Heritage Fund, and we also worked very closely with TAWA in Tanzania, who are the Wildlife Management Authority, the National Commission for Monuments and Museums in Nigeria, and also the local branches of ICOMOS in these countries as well. And really this being able to have such a broad team of people was incredibly central to making this project a success, even if managerially speaking, it was quite challenging at times. Next slide, please. So the first site then, and the site we're going to look at today, we're not really going to look at Sukur in Nigeria today. We're going to stay looking at East Africa because we've already kind of introduced it, is the ruins of Kilwa Kisawani and the ruins of Songo Manora World Heritage Property. And in this case, we're just going to focus on the workshop component where we saw the adaptation of the CVI technique and not the training component of the project. So this is the site here shown in a satellite image. You can see that whereas this is a coastal site, it's actually 2 islands, which are quite low-lying islands, heavily impacted and have been for the last 10 years by the impacts of rising sea levels and increased storminess, and in particular the increase in monsoons in this area over the last 10 years. Next slide, please. As with all great plans for the last 3 or 4 years, COVID got in the way. We wrote this application at a time where we envisioned being able to meet in person. That was not possible. At the heart of the CVI technique is a community workshop which brings together diverse stakeholders from both the academic and heritage profession, but also, importantly, the wider communities, people who live in the villages around the sites, in this case, fishermen, tour guides, people whose values with the site might intersect with or be different to the traditional heritage values. And because it was not possible to visit Tanzania in person, we actually just collected everybody up and brought them to a hotel in Dar es Salaam, so that we were able to engage in this workshop together. And some people joined remotely. And this allowed us to hear about the experiences of people, to observe, as I think Dr. Luana used the word observe, but also to really try and make this a joint decision-making process about how we can assess the different aspects and different components of vulnerability, which we just introduced. In this case, the core group of our partners were present together in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, with everybody else joining remotely on Zoom, and we ran this over 3 days. Next slide, please. Key here was understanding, of course, the climate science, which we talked about, and understanding the impacts experienced at the site. We've introduced some of these already in the form of coastal erosion, also talking about adaptive capacity in terms of the planting of mangroves. Next slide, please. And then, of course, was identifying what the key values and stressors are. So on the left-hand side here, we can see key heritage values taken from the statement of OUV, and on atop the higher up here at the top on the y-axis, we can see which climate stressors are most likely to affect these values. And rather, we had often assumed that it was going to be rising sea level that was going to be the most impactful thing at the site, and in coastal erosion. It actually emerged through discussions with local partners that it was the intense precipitation or heavy rainfall that was doing the most damage to both the heritage and the non-heritage values, because this was cutting gullies into the ground and causing lots of problem and subsistence to both the extant and underground archaeological deposits. Next slide, please. Once we had established what the key values were for the OUV and also the key hazards, so these are specifically just for the heritage values at the site, which is how CVI works. It creates a distinction between heritage and non-heritage values. It was then possible for us to look at both the exposure, which is the degree to which these values and attributes are at risk, and also the sensitivity, which is the extent to which they can be damaged by these climate factors. It was then possible to get the potential impact shown here in purple, which was identified as being high, moderate, and extreme. And then we brought in this adaptive capacity, which included the local management response, the scientific and technical support, and the effectiveness of current measures, which allowed us to create an assessment of vulnerability by looking at the potential impact and, in a sense, subtracting the adaptive capacity from this. And the site was found to have a moderate vulnerability. The outstanding universal value at the site was found to have a moderate vulnerability. Next slide, please. Of course, the OUV then also looks at these questions of community and socioeconomic values. In this case, just to give some example, things like fishing. While the site is inscribed as a cultural World Heritage Site, it has substantial natural values which need to be accounted for, and specifically the biological diversity. Whereas not a huge amount of people visit, those who do are very important economically for the community, so there are economic values. And then there are some traditional values still associated with the site, specifically boat building. Next slide, please. So when we look at the community response and adaptive capacity to these values, again, we do a similar exercise in identifying what these are. In this case, conservation efforts at the site, are doing a lot to minimize these risks and these impacts. And we can see that whereas the impact on these socio-cultural values is low anyway, the adaptive capacity is also quite low, so the community vulnerability was deemed in this case to also be low. So from Kilwa-Kisawani, we can see that the potential impact, the vulnerability of the site to the site's heritage values are deemed to be moderate. The vulnerability of the site's community and economic values are deemed to be low. Next slide, please. So just before I finish, I want to point people in the direction of some of the articles we've talked about today. The easiest way to find these is just to search for them on Google, followed by ICOMOS archive. Each of these projects have links, which you'll find. Some other important resources here are reports from the working group over the last while. The 2 vulnerability workshops in Tanzania and Nigeria have both been published. The Tanzania one in both English and Swahili, and then some of the ongoing work of the working group in terms of creating resource manuals and other things, which you will also find on the ICOMOS Climate Action Group website. Next slide. So thank you very much. These are all the people who I just like to thank. I'd also like to thank again Fabiana and Paul for inviting me to speak to you all today, and to thank again Dr. Luana Campos for her wonderful introduction. And I hope you'll see some synergies between some of the themes which she introduced and some of the topics which I have talked about today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. William. That was amazing. I mean, more than synergy, I think, absolute synergy. I just wanted to make some comments because, as I was listening to you, I remembered Dr. Luana's presentation. I love how you started with why heritage when there was such an emergency of, other risks. But I love that, cultural heritage is the memory of humanity. We always have to think about people-centered structures, and how when people talk about what they lost is about loss of identity, and when they talk about the losses in major climate disasters. So and also bringing back the idea of cultural heritage as an asset based on local knowledge systems. So I think that's great and resonates with what Luana was saying earlier. And also about climate justice that you talk as well, which also resonates with what Luana was saying, about how usually you have the knowledge coming from different areas and you need to, external knowledge coming in, and we really have to look at local knowledge systems. But naturally, as we moved on in your lecture about vulnerability assessment, and that was amazing, how you create this climate vulnerability index and what is to be saved and what can't be saved and what should be saved, and about adaptation. That was really amazing. We have so many questions, but I'm afraid we don't have that much time, so I'm picking a question here which I think is very interesting, and for both Luana and Dr. William. Also, Luana, if you have any comments, would you like to make any comments at this point? Yeah, I think I'll open up for question.
Sim, Fabiana, obrigada por me ter a palavra. Dr. William, desculpa, eu vou falar em português, mas
okay,
excelente
so
apresentação. Realmente,
Dr. William was an excellent presentation. So thank you very much for sharing this information with us. And Paul, thank you for giving us the opportunity to have these spaces for sharing knowledge. That's very important. The role of People's Palace Project has been of great importance in this sense. So, Fabiana, it was great to see some convergence between our talks. And this shows us how much we're heading towards the same place. We're going in the same direction. because Dr. William
patrimônio mais material,
talks about a more material heritage. So it's focused on materiality and archaeology. And this includes looking at the communities and the locations. That's exceptional because until a little while ago, me, as an archaeologist, I know a little bit about this field. And in the past, we didn't have this interaction, and so we were criticized for this. There was no interaction between the preservation of material archaeology and the knowledge of communities. These two things seem to be separate. So in looking at the methodology that he's using and that he was presenting to us, I can see that the methodology is very similar to the methodology that we've been using in our traditional communities, where there is no monumentality of heritage, but where there is some materiality. And this is important because these are very specific issues that are somewhat different. And I'd like to extend the invitation to Dr. William to apply here in Brazil the CVI, that is, this climate vulnerability analysis. Maybe we can apply this methodology to some of our projects here. This notion of that adaptability and loss that Dr. William talks about is exceptional, especially for us to start a debate in Brazil about loss. I mentioned hard talk in my talk because we are still very much attached to heritage. Just to give you an idea, we don't have a policy of discarding archaeological heritage yet, and we don't have a debate in the sense that we should understand the priorities and understand that there's some heritage that we will not be able to save, when speaking about materiality. And I would just like to ask a question to Dr. William. How are the communities in these countries where he's been working, how have the communities been receiving this methodology and this intervention that you've been proposing?
Dr. Campos, thank you very much for that great question. The CVI technique is a technique developed to look at world heritage in particular. That somewhat limits its applicability, I think. And so since finishing this project, we've started a new project which is looking at 10 global sites, including living landscapes and indigenous communities and partners. The question on how communities have been receiving this, we had originally envisioned that the CVI Africa Project would be community run in terms of their workshops. We felt this was important because we don't need another technique where someone like me comes in and does it there. We need to embed this knowledge in local communities and with local custodians. And so in our new project, we're running these workshops that are entirely community-led. And this means that, especially in the values component, we're getting a far broader understanding of values, which extends beyond just the plant heritage, built heritage, into the procedural, into the intangible. So, for example, one of our partners is the rights heritage in the Philippines, which is a living indigenous community. And very few of the values and attributes there are tangible. They're largely intangible. So I think if there was one weakness with the CVI Africa Project, it was because of COVID, it remained a quite top-down process, which meant that communities were responding as participants as opposed to partners. And we've since moved on to a model more bottom-up, and participants are in the process, and we're just advising on it, which I think I'm much more comfortable with, because it also means that when we leave, this knowledge is there and embedded and becomes part of the ongoing management and conservation of sites. Does that answer your question?
Thank
Thank you so much. I'm wondering, Paul, do we have to be last question, or I think there's a really interesting question, I think, for us to just to wrap up here.
Essa é uma pergunta muito interessante
So
para
the question
concluir.
is, there was a
Então a
significant
pergunta é:
achievement at
houve uma
COP27 when
conquista
cultural heritage was
significativa na
mentioned as part of the
COP27
Sharm
quando o
el-Sheikh
patrimônio cultural
agreement. What are your
foi mencionado
expectations,
como
that's for
parte
both
do
of us,
acordo.
for COP28 around cultural heritage? Don't know who would like to start, but look, Dr. Luana, maybe.
Desculpa, Fabiana, eu não estou te ouvindo.
Não? Ah, então.
Okay,
Me escuta?
Ainda não.
I can come in on that. They might.
You can come
Yeah,
in,
okay.
and I'll.
Sure. So just for background for people maybe not familiar with COP and all that, COP is the Conference of Parties. It's where all the signatories to UNFCCC come together to discuss climate action. And it's in the past, it's often focused on mitigation, which is how do we reduce greenhouse gases. And then in recent years, more on adaptation, which is how do we prepare for the future impacts of climate change to minimize its impacts. At the last COP, and actually the previous COP, cultural heritage was explicitly mentioned under the topic of what's called non-economic loss for the first time, although it was very focused on tangible heritage as opposed to intangible heritage. Nonetheless, I think this is a very important inclusion because it feeds into the discussion on loss and damage, which is another huge area with different meanings within climate change. But essentially, loss and damage is both the impacts of climate change nationally, but also on a personal level, also on a community level. And I think the most exciting thing from the last COP was setting up the Loss and Damage Fund, where wealthier nations pay in to, in some way, assist poorer nations to adapt. And the inclusion of cultural heritage in that has meant that that funding can potentially be used to actually do that, to actually assist with that. So I would be. It's hard not to be cynical, but I think that's positive in that it's going in the right direction. One of our outputs from the IPCC meeting is to recommend a special report on culture and climate by the IPCC, and that would make it a specific part of every COP going forward, which I think would be really, really interesting, because that way we're not siloing it. Our point is always this is part of everything, not just one thing. So that would be my answer to that. I think the Loss and Damage Fund incorporating losses to cultural heritage with culture with a big C and also impacting on culture with a large C in terms of change, societal change. Thank you.
Thank you. Luana, I don't know if you followed that. Did you get the translation this time? Or?
A tradução, sim, mas eu não ouvi a pergunta.
So the question
yes,
was,
I heard the translation. I didn't hear the question.
If you feel that, what are your expectations for COP28 around cultural heritage?
Ah, sim. Obrigada, Fabiana.
Okay.
Como nós
Thank you,
estamos
Fabiana.
às vezes tem um probleminha aqui com o som, mas a gente supera isso.
Sorry, sometimes, we have some problems with the sound, but I think, we end up overcoming that.
Então, as nossas expectativas, eu alinho com a resposta
So,
do Dr. William.
my expectations are aligned to, what Dr. Williams said.
Mais presente nessa COP,
I think the material aspect will be more present in this new COP because materiality has visibility. This isn't an easy issue to deal with, but basically the risks become more evident. Here we're talking about small risks on a global scale, but these are risks that endanger the lives of people in all of their aspects.
Com a subida do nível do mar, por exemplo, e
It
alteração
includes,
dos
for example, the problem related to the
que já
rising
não
sea levels,
a
of
aplicação
school of fish,
coloca
how
essa
that's changed.
em risco, em
And this
insegurança
basically
alimentar.
ends up endangering these communities and creates food insecurity for them. So these issues
Como questões,
that are dealt with,
como eu posso dizer, secundárias,
these issues that are considered secondary, unfortunately,
destaque maior. E eu iria
they
além,
they need
espero que essa questão
they need
esteja
more discussion.
na próxima COP, mas
And
principalmente ela
so I
apareça
hope this issue will be talked about more at the next COP,
aqui no Brasil.
at the next COP, and I hope that we talk more about this here in Brazil
Thank
as
you
well.
very much. I think, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. We have so many other questions, and I'm sure everyone here could stay much longer in this conversation. It was just amazing, wasn't it, Paul? I mean, it was beautiful discussion and so many different insights.
Luana, what a great place to finish on with that hope that COP will come to Brazil. And of course, that raises the question of which Brazils will be hosting that. But I'm very confident that the sort of work that both of you do ensures that different people will be talking about this in the next 10 years. I know that webinars have problems of delay, atrasos. It's almost like a symbol for what you've both been talking about, that there has been so much delay and so much atraso in actually getting the right people to that proverbial table and ensuring that we can actually have the debate that we need to have. And what's been so brilliant about what both of you have done today is actually, I think, inspire all of us to think about how we make that happen. As Luana says, because it's in these small acts, these small changes, both the negative and the positive, that real change happens. And so it's been completely inspirational to listen to you both. Just amazing. And it was nice. Thank you for your comments, Luana, about People's Palace projects, but you've given us even greater responsibility now to ensure that this debate does not finish here and that we find ways in which we can take these ideas, really practical ideas, really positive ideas that you've given us, how we can take them forward. So thank you to both of you and to Fabiana, and of course to our amazing translators who make this all possible, that we can do, and technicians, that we can make this all possible on a Tuesday morning, Tuesday afternoon. So thank you.
Yes,
Fabiana.
thank you all, and see you again, everyone watching, next Tuesday for our last webinar of the series. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.